All right, welcome back to economics. This is Dr. Kling, and today's talk is about GDP. We're going to have a few talks about GDP. Today the focus is just on what does it measure. So it stands for Gross Domestic Product. So that's where those letters GDP come from. Now, product means it's measuring what gets produced. I think of it as a measure of economic activity. And other people do. Other people think of it as a measure of economic activity. And remember, I think of economic activity as outsourcing. So it's stuff that is produced for trade or for sale in the market. Okay, so that's what the product part is. Stuff that it's goods and services that are produced for sale in the market. Domestic means it's produced within our borders. So if we have an American company that owns a factory overseas, the value of what that factory produces really should not be counted in domestic product. And gross, that has to do with the depreciation of capital. This is a concept we haven't even talked about yet. But let's say you replace your roof with a new roof. What the gross domestic product will measure is the value of the new roof. What it doesn't tell you is that your old roof depreciated, or that other people with roofs, their roofs are getting old and they're depreciating. It doesn't measure that. It's measuring the value of the new roof. Actually, let me back up a bit. It's not so much that gross domestic product doesn't track depreciation. It doesn't count the roof shingles that have to be made to make up for the depreciation that's going on. It doesn't calculate how much you need to keep up with the depreciation. So gross includes all the investment that takes place. It doesn't care whether that investment is replacing just enough to keep up with depreciation, replacement of stuff that's worn out, or whether it's new. It just doesn't care whether it's new or whether it's replacement for depreciation. That's the sense. That's what the gross means. Now, gross domestic product does not include sort of household production that is not for the market. So the classic housework, like cooking, cleaning, laundry, typically would be not included if not bought from the market. So there's sort of an old feminist critique of this. They notice that sort of more women than men do housework, mean, go back to the 1970s or something, and housework is not counted in GDP, therefore GDP is sexist. Okay, now my view of that is the sexist component is really here. That is, if more women do housework, that's really what the feminists ought to be complaining about. More women really should be doing work in the market and less doing housework, and I think that trend has been going on for many years, and certainly you can see it happening since the 70s. As far as housework not counted in, so I think this is sort of wrong that this happens, should not happen. I think this is right. I think not counting housework in GDP is right. And that goes back to my view that economic activity is outsourcing. So you should only count it when what you're doing is your comparative advantage. So my comparative advantage is not folding laundry, and so it should not count in GDP. My wife's comparative advantage is not cooking, and so it should not count in GDP. Now, if Wolfgang Puck and Julia Child cook for themselves, well, maybe you could argue that that counts in GDP because people pay Wolfgang Puck or Julia Child while she was alive. They would pay them to cook. So if you're doing something that you're paid to do, that should count in GDP. By the way, I don't get paid to teach, so my teaching probably shouldn't count in GDP. So the problem isn't that GDP is sexist. I disagree with that. So I disagree. I think that is correct not to count housework in GDP because housework is people typically doing things that are not their comparative advantage. So they're not engaging in economic activity. I think of housework at best as part of what I might call planned leisure, which is not counted in GDP, but is a measure of is included in well-being. So you can think of well-being might be, if you were trying to do national well-being, which I don't think is such a great concept, GDP plus planned leisure. My point there is you would not just want to count GDP because if you have two countries with the same GDP and the same number of people, and one country people are just going to the beach all the time, just sitting around doing nothing most of the time, and the other country they're working like crazy, you're definitely better off in the country where people can get just as much goods and services but have more planned leisure. I use the word planned because there's things like involuntary unemployment that kind of mess up the always using leisure as the measure. So anyway, bottom line is I agree with the idea of not including non-market work. There are all sorts of other issues with measuring GDP. For example, suppose I go down to a drugstore and buy some hair gel. And the first thing you should do is laugh, because if you could see me, you could see that I have absolutely no possible use for hair gel. But if I buy hair gel from a drugstore, that shows up in GDP. So hair gel from a drugstore, that purchase will show up in GDP. If a hair salon buys hair gel and then uses it on your haircut, then you have to be careful about double counting. If we were to count both the purchase of the hair gel and the cost of your haircut in GDP, we might very well end up double counting the hair gel. We've got to make sure that the cost of the hair gel gets netted out of the cost of the haircut, or we've got to find some way to make sure that we don't double count. So there are an awful lot of conceptual issues with GDP. Sort of conceptual issues like that one, where we only want to look at, in this case, we only want to look at final output, not double count intermediate inputs. So only want to look at final output, net of intermediate inputs. And there are all kinds of issues with how to go about surveying and who to ask and what to ask to find out what GDP is. You could actually easily take a whole semester course in GDP, and even in a freshman course, typical freshman textbook, there's a lot more said about GDP than I'm going to say. They're just a lot of issues about it. It's not like concepts in physics or whatever, where, velocity or mass or temperature, where it's well understood what you're trying to measure and the measurement instruments are well understood. But economists end up treating it as if treating GDP as if it were a very precise concept, very well-defined concept like mass or velocity or temperature. But in fact, it's a much more complicated thing underneath all that. And I think I'll stop there.